Okay. Oh, can we start recording? There we go. Okay, let's get started then. Welcome everybody to our event, webinar on cybersecurity. My name is George Paik. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the World Affairs Forum. For those of you who don't know, the World Affairs Forum is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to expanding understanding of world affairs and of America's role in the world. Been around since 1946, and we love hosting events like this. A number of you know that we're used to doing these in person, and rest assured we're figuring out how to get back to that in the fall. But I think that our online presence has served us well. We've had a number of wonderful events through the pandemic period. We have one more coming up in June with William M. Bowden of Georgetown talking about religion and foreign affairs. But today we have a wonderful speaker, Klon Kitchen. I'll let Frank introduce him in a moment. Frank is our program committee chair, and I will take the opportunity to say, look at our website and see our sponsors. Frank is our friend at GenRe, who is one of our sponsors. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into that. If you have questions now or at any time, please put them in the Q&A box. You'll see that button at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring Q&A, and that's where I'll be looking while I try to crack this. So if you put it there as opposed to the chat box, I'll be more likely to see it. Other than that, hope everybody enjoys and gets what they're looking for out of this. I'm sure you'll be enlightened in a way that you might not have expected. And I will now turn it over to Frank Bria, chair of our program committee.
Thanks, George. And Klon, thank you so much for taking George's invitation to join us this afternoon. We are delighted to have you. So just for those of you who have not reviewed Klon's background, Klon is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on national security and defense technologies innovation. Through his research, Klon works to understand and explain how emerging technologies are shaping modern statecraft, intelligence, warfighting, tracking, cybersecurity developments, artificial intelligence, robotics, and quantum sciences. Before joining the American Enterprise Institute, Mr. Kitchen was director of the Heritage Foundation's Center for Technology Policy. Prior to that, he served as a national security advisor to U.S. Senator Ben Sasse, and was instrumental in the creation of a blue ribbon commission entitled U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission to develop an American grand strategy for cyber. Klon has chaired the National Counterterrorism Center at National Defense University and has also served as a senior officer on the staff of the Director of Central Intelligence Agency. He has also served as a lead analyst on Al-Qaeda leadership at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Klon is well published and has appeared on many major news stations and newscasts, including 60 Minutes and the New York Times podcast, The Argument. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over now to Klon. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, George, and thank you for all of our attendees. My intention is to keep my opening remarks very brief, honestly, just to build a bit of a scene setter. Just because, one, I don't enjoy hearing myself just kind of talk incessantly, but then two, there's been a lot of technology and cyber related news recently, and I imagine that there'll be enough Q&A to keep us busy for the whole hour. So I want to make sure that I'm responsive to that, but maybe in an effort to set the stage, maybe provoke a couple questions in the minds of the attendees. I'll offer three general observations that I think really set the context for much of what we're observing in kind of contemporary politics and world affairs and the like. So the first thing I would say is that technology is a whole of government issue. And what I mean by that is that technology is not just a growing variable in our daily lives. Certainly, it is becoming almost ubiquitous, right? From what we carry on our pockets to what we wear on our wrists, to how we do our work, to how we communicate with friends and family. how we record our lives so that we can remember them, how we do our banking. Well, all of this is beginning to permeate virtually every aspect of government life. Certainly on the national security and foreign policy side, certainly on the domestic cybersecurity side. But you know, our economy is largely driven by the technology industry. It is a growing portion of the nation's GDP, and it is a aspect of governance now that transcends domestic, foreign, what we consider, you know, kind of traditional services, government services. It is a key variable in the public sector, the private sector, and in the nonprofit or public interest sector. So what that all means is not just that it's everywhere and that it's super meaningful, but it also means that to wrap our heads around technology as a variable and as an issue to be engaged is requiring a greater level of cooperation and coordination amongst those various aspects of society. So government is having to be better at engaging the private sector and the nonprofit public interest sector. And if it doesn't get better at that, then it's going to be increasingly irrelevant and unable to address many of the challenges and to realize many of the opportunities that it's going to face as it regards technology. And all of that is true with the other two sectors as well. Both public and nonprofit public interest sectors are going to have to get better at dealing with each other and the government if they want to realize the rewards of emerging technologies, as well as mitigate the risks that come with emerging technology. So that's my first point, that technology is a whole of government issue. It's a whole of society issue. Related to that, one of the key realities that the United States government particularly is having to embrace is that the federal government is a national security stakeholder. It is no longer the national security stakeholder. What do I mean by that? Well, many of the technologies that are going to be decisively shaping certainly future battlefields, but also the domestic tranquility aspects of our life together. And then increasingly how modern governance is done. These are technologies that are kind of what we call the new general purpose technologies, ones that are going to transcend industries and have very broad and deep applications. Things like artificial intelligence, things like robotics and advanced automation, things potentially in the coming decade or two, quantum computing and advancing quantum sciences. All of these things are being developed predominantly in the private sector for commercial applications. And the government simply does not have the capacity, and there's no reason to believe that it will have the capacity anytime soon, to unilaterally assert itself in any of these technologies or in any of these industries. And yet they're going to be fundamental. And so the government is now having to deal with the realization that it cannot decisively engage these things on its own, and that it therefore must partner with the private sector in a way that previously it hasn't had to at this scale, this comprehensively. On the flip side of that, industry is now having to recognize that it has a growing national security responsibility. And the challenge is that the incentives for both government and industry work at cross purposes for where I think they need to go. They need to be more cooperative and more engaged, but the natural incentives or the kind of near-term incentives make that less likely. So on the government side, they're not used to saying please. They're not used to having to play nice. They're used to be able to, especially on national security issues, being able to walk in and say, we're from DC, this is the way it is, and here's how you're gonna, kind of comply. And sometimes there's really good reasons for that, because there's all kinds of things that we can't share, and there's kind of real meaningful existential challenges that we don't have time to explain. We just need to kind of get to it. On the industrial side, the fact that there's a growing national security responsibility, that only makes their life harder. It complicates the global marketplace. It complicates how they have cultivated their own workforces, many of whom, especially in the large tech industry, don't understand themselves to be kind of American first. Many of them aren't American first. And so they have an internal dynamic that's very difficult. And then obviously this has market implications for them. If they're seen by a foreign nation as being too closely aligned with the US government, then that can have a very negative impact on their company's bottom line. Nevertheless, the realities that I described previously are present. And in the past, we have thought of the internet and technology as being this kind of borderless panacea where everything's going to be fine. Well, that dream didn't live very long. And governments have realized that, no, governments are still the ones with sovereignty. The internet exists on servers, and those servers exist in a geopolitical place within borders, and we control those borders, and therefore we can act. And so nation states are beginning to reassert sovereignty over technology, and it's increasingly being used as an element of national power. And I think that the key issue, or the key example of that, is China, and the way that China fuses its government with its industry such that they cooperate to achieve kind of strategic ends. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But that leads me to my third and final kind of general point, and that is that we're either going to get China right or we're going to get everything wrong. What I mean by that is simply that the challenge of normalizing and moving the relationship with China into a sustainable place is very difficult, and it's only getting more difficult in the near term. But how we ultimately resolve, or at least manage, that challenge is going to decisively shape much of everything else that our government is doing. And it is proving difficult. Just as a kind of overview of kind of my view of this, China is like every nation in the history of the world in that it seeks to amass and to use geopolitical influence or power for its interests. That is a rational and coherent way of operating in their national system, and I don't really begrudge them that generally. China has also, I think, again, rightly concluded that to amass and to wield that influence globally and effectively will necessarily involve leading in a couple of key technology-related industries, and we've mentioned some of them: AI and robotics and advanced manufacturing and the like. I think that's true. I think that's right. And I think the United States has largely made that same conclusion. The difference is that China is also trying to pioneer a new form of governance, one that they believe can marry the wealth of their form of managed capitalism with the stability and strength of authoritarianism. And they understand, and I think they're right, that technology, and especially emerging technologies, are decisive capabilities in realizing both of those aspects of this new model of governance that they want to pioneer. It's not guaranteed that it's going to work, but there is enough reason to believe that it could work, or that it could work well enough to where this type of technologically enabled totalitarianism could ultimately become the chief export along China's Belt and Road. And if they can, in fact, demonstrate that you can have a wealthy country and a totalitarian country enabled by technology, there will be a line of would-be dictatorships around the globe lining up, looking to buy that. And then China will offer, techno-totalitarianism in a box. They will gladly build the infrastructure to support that, deploy it and manage it for you, and then reap all of the data whirlwind from it as well. So those are my kind of three orienting points. I haven't mentioned the colonial pipeline, but I'm very much happy to talk about it. I haven't mentioned SolarWinds. I'm very happy to talk about that. I haven't mentioned the Chinese hacking of the Microsoft Exchange servers or Section 230 or anything else, but I'm happy to go into any of that. But those 3 points: tech is a whole of government issue. Government is a national security stakeholder, not the stakeholder, and that we're either going to get China right or everything wrong. Those are my 3 orienting points. So with that, I'm happy to engage in whatever questions we have.
Great. Thank you so much, Klon. Appreciate that to start with. Frank, as our chair, you want to take a first shot? You're muted. You're
Sure.
muted.
The first question really has to do with partnerships in terms of private public partnerships. I'd be really interested to hear, Klon, what your thoughts are in terms of what kind of partnerships you think are needed, specifically in the context of insurance, because I know after 9/11 and after major terrorist attacks, the government has come to the insurance industry and says you have to find a way to insure this risk. And with cyber and specifically ransomware specifically, that's a pretty tall task, especially given the industry's experience with ransomware. As you probably know better than I, ransomware is exploding, and it's exploded over the last 4 or 5 years due to a lack of enforcement. First at the FBI, but now it seems like it may be, but it's not going away. It seems to be getting worse. So is it fair to assume that that an industry like ours can absorb all that risk? And is that the right solution, or do you envision something that's a little bit better way to incentivize that kind of innovation, where at least in the risk spreading area?
Yeah, the difficult challenge of cyber insurance is that the scale is so big. It's a massive cost. So I'm going to look at some notes. So if you see me looking down to my right, I'm looking at notes because I want to. Let's see, with the average payment last year in just the US when it comes to ransomware was $312,000, 493 cents. That's up 171% over 2019. So that was the average ransomware payment in 2020. $350 million in US ransom payments were made in 2020. That's up 311% over 2019. So this is a big problem. It's only getting bigger because while that's a pretty high volume of ransomware attacks, the percentage of the economy that's actually been affected by ransomware attacks is still relatively small, but that's going to increase. And so we're going to be talking about very large numbers. And that's one of the challenges with cyber insurance, is that I don't know that you have a large enough marketplace right now to support the types of payoff and the risk that it naturally engenders. And so that obviously leads people to ask questions, well, okay, so what's the federal government's role here? And I don't think we know that yet. I think the federal government can honestly look at the size and scale of this and also say, like, well, we can't afford that either. I mean, like, we can't just stroke a check and cover that down. At the same time, our economy can't just kind of keep taking body blow after body blow after body blow. And so I think that's a part of what we're trying to do. So one of the key aspects of this is something that the administration just rolled out. They did an executive order last night on making some adjustments in terms of how the federal government is going to improve its posture vis-a-vis cybersecurity and information sharing and all these other things. And the strategy there is, look, if we change the federal side, that will have kind of a trickle-down influence in terms of how the private sector reacts. They'll have to align if they want to be a contractor with us. And then that will hopefully, over the course of time, shape how the way industry is thinking about that. So if that strategy works out, and it's going to be all about execution, but if that strategy works out, we'll be in a better place, but it doesn't fundamentally change the underlying problem, Frank, that you've identified. Look, what we've got to figure out is a way that we make the numbers work from a market perspective. I mean, that's what we've got to get to. And if I had a clear line that I could draw from here to there, I'd be rich. And I haven't figured that out yet, but
it's a hard question. I think it just highlights some of the challenges. I think this conversation needs to take place, and I couldn't agree with you more. I just know that these are some of the conversations I hope will transpire, despite the
that's right,
lack of consensus on some of these issues.
Yep.
Well, thanks. Well, the questions are rolling in, and already I can see a bit of a theme here from several of them. So I hope this answers those askers. It's about social media, Facebook and Twitter, what they do with information. What about TikTok in China and all the Gen Z people who go through there? what progress can be made in imposing that? And is it realistic to expect? Do you think that Congress would update Section 230?
Okay, so I'll hit those in kind of my preferred order there. So let's
Sure.
talk TikTok. So George mentioned that I've been on 60 Minutes. It was specifically about TikTok. This is the way I like to phrase it to appropriately freak everybody out. If we woke up tomorrow morning and there was a newscast that said we had discovered that China had secretly distributed 100 million sensors around the United States, and that every time an American walked past one of these sensors, it grabbed off of one of our phones our contacts, our online viewing history and purchasing history, our GPS location history, even our keyboard patterns and swipes, which means passwords, and 1,000 other pieces of data. There would be a collective, rightly, freak out, right? That China had done something like that. And what does this mean? Well, China has done this. TikTok is a US subsidiary of a Chinese company called ByteDance. And TikTok collects all of that information and more, and explicitly says so in its terms of service. And they have 100 million American users. So what I've described is reality, because China has a national security and cybersecurity law that they've been kind enough to put into English that requires that every bit and byte of data that resides on, transits over, or any other way touches the network of a Chinese company and any of its subsidiaries, or of the network of any American or other foreign company operating in China, that access to that data must be provided to the government in Beijing by law. And that if you don't provide that access, you will not be doing business in China. And that's it. It's not ambiguous. It's not more difficult than that. It's not really confusing. It's a very clear line of march, and it's all there. And so TikTok is just the latest example. These are the underlying concerns that we've had with Huawei, the telecommunications company, ZTE, telecommunications company, and I could list literally 100 and plus other Chinese companies who would kind of fit into this. And it's the key point there is that I don't have to tell you that any one of these Chinese companies is malevolent and evil. They simply have to be compliant with Chinese law. And if they're not compliant with Chinese law, then they're not going to be in business very long. So the threat model is not difficult. A lot of people like to make it sound like it's more complicated than it really isn't. And so that's kind of my take on TikTok. And, I was asked by the reporter at 60 Minutes, they're like, well, look, kids are just wanting to do dance videos. They're just trying to have fun. And I said, I get it. Like, I don't begrudge them having dance, like have fun. I love that. But here's the problem. Their ignorance of the threat does nothing to diminish it. And that's where we are, right? So that's TikTok. Okay, big social media companies, they're powerful. That's without a doubt true. They are increasingly influential. They have a lot of information. They're able to do a lot with that information. I'm not indifferent to any of that. And I definitely have concerns about their social impact and the like. Here's the other part of that, though. They're powerful because we make them powerful. I mean, like, we use them, I mean, we do the drug deal, and they give us, content and a platform for free, right? We're not paying cash for it in exchange for, hey, look, we're a marketing company. That's the thing you need to understand about these companies. If you're thinking about Facebook or YouTube as a, kind of cat pictures and funny videos platform, that is not what they are. They are advertising platforms. And you are the product. And if you understand them that way, I think you begin to understand why they make the decisions they make. Now, the good news is you have a choice. Now, it's also true that if you choose not to participate on these platforms, as I have, you're definitely making a trade. You're definitely choosing not to participate in certain aspects of what has kind of become popular culture. One, I would say, it's a pretty good trade. I don't know that I feel any loss there. But then two, there are alternatives. They're not as big. They're not as influential. But I generally fall into the category of like, if people are really feeling a pain point, like if they are really feeling abused, they'll walk. That being said, okay, so that's my, kind of like American, like, hey, we're masters of our own destiny kind of part of the talk. The other part, though, is with things like Section 230. Section 230, for those who don't know, is an aspect of something called the Communications Decency Act. And what Section 230 does is it provides what's called intermediary liability protections for online web presence. So, for example, if you are Coca-Cola and you put out a piece of content online, Section 230 says, okay, Coke, you're not going to be held responsible because some crazy neo-Nazi left a crazy statement in the comment section. Because that's not, you didn't say that. The fact that they left it on your website doesn't make you liable, right? So that's Section 230. It also tells someone like Facebook that they can't be sued because of a piece of content that I put onto their platform. It also tells Facebook that they can't be sued for removing a piece of content that they don't want to host on their platform. And so Section 230 has protections both for what we would call kind of the over moderation of content and the under moderation of content. The background is that when Section 230 was written in 1996, the web was still new, and there were these chat rooms, and they were starting to get some pretty awful content. I mean, we all understand what the internet becomes when it's left alone. Well, they were starting to get some pretty awful content, and a couple of content providers said, we don't want to have this stuff on our website. And so they started removing it. Well, certain people said that is a violation of our free speech, and we're going to sue you. And that is when the litigation began. And Section 230 was intended, in part, to free platforms up to not have to host content that they didn't want to host. And all that to say, in the modern context, Section 230 is often viewed as a political mechanism that can be used by threatening it, that we can coerce online platforms that are seen as being abusive or somehow bad into kind of acting in a way that we're more happy with. The industry will tell you that Section 230 is sacrosanct, and if you got rid of Section 230, we'll never innovate again, and the economy is going to come ground to a halt, and China wins. I don't believe that either. Section 230 is not sacrosanct. Technology companies operate without Section 230 around the world. But I do think it's policy objectives of trying to kind of keep the internet a civil place and protecting people from unnecessary litigation. I think that's a fine political objective. And I've written a paper called Section 230, Mend It, Don't End It. I think it can be reformed. I think we could tighten some screws. But I don't think we should get rid of it. But if it was gotten rid of, I don't think it's the end of the world either.
Great. I see another theme developing here. Russia. What about Russia? Is it worse than China and North Korea? What about solar winds? How should we respond? What should Europe's role be? And I guess you tweeted something about Colonial pipeline and talked about a thought exercise relative to solar winds and dark side and what maybe Russia gets out of it. Maybe that's related to places like a Hungary or a Turkey as well. I don't know, but I see a sort of complex there. Thought I'd ask you about, put those to you.
Sure. Asking if Russia's worse than China is worse than North Korea, worse than Iran. It's not an irrelevant question. It's a good question, as a matter of fact. But it's also a little bit like, well, do you want to die from cancer, from getting your head knocked off, or in a car wreck? Well, I'd prefer not to have any of them. So it's kind of different styles of mutilation, really. Let me compare and contrast Russia's action on solar winds, China's recent attack on the Microsoft Exchange servers, and then maybe we can talk about the Colonial attack as well. Okay, so the SolarWinds attack is massive. It is huge. And it is what is called a supply chain attack. And what they did was the Russian military and intelligence groups, they're two different cyber actors, but they often cooperate, where the intel group will kind of, or excuse me, the military group will kind of find their way in, and then they'll hand it off to the intel section and they'll do all the exploitation. When it came to SolarWinds, they said, okay, you know what, we've decided there are a ton of really attractive targets who use this SolarWinds server maintenance service. So instead of trying to break into a couple 100,000 endpoints, let's just break into the SolarWinds server, put a plant on that. And so that when all of their clients connect and back up their stuff and then update their software, we'll just flow into that, right? So it's like go to the headwater instead of all the kind of individual tributaries. It's a brilliant strategy. It's called a supply chain attack. It works, obviously. Well, in the case of the SolarWinds, they got into a lot, including the US Nuclear Security Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, multiple branches of the US military, and then just a ton of private sector. They got into the White House. They got into a lot of places. When they got in, what they would do though, and this was the peculiarity with the way they did it, was as they would kind of go in, so as the Russians would enter into one of their targets, they would digitally kind of close the door behind them. And they would make it look like nobody had ever come in and everything was fine. And then what they would do is they would build a new door that no one knew about, right? So they had the point of entry, how they got in. But once they got in, they sealed it so that it looked like nobody had ever been there. And then they created a super secret trapdoor that only they knew about, right? So that they could get in again without it ever looking like it was disturbing. So that's normal operating procedure in terms of cyber espionage. It's something our cyber ninjas do. But one of the challenges is that, so we know that we closed the door that they went through. We don't know how many of those secret trapdoors they installed. So it is a very difficult process kind of going through and finding all those. So the appropriate way to understand SolarWinds is that it's ongoing. They're still in those networks. It's still a problem. Okay. Now the Chinese model on what happened with the Microsoft Exchange servers. A couple 100,000 Microsoft Exchange servers around the world. The Chinese found a vulnerability and started kind of going through. And what happened was they would get into the email servers, that's the Exchange server, and then from there they would escalate their privileges, meaning they would be able to kind of spread throughout the network. Well, as soon as the Chinese operatives found out that the gig was up and that they'd been discovered, instead of doing what the Russians did, where they'd kind of secretly close the door and install backdoors and all that kind of stuff, they threw the doors open and screamed to all their crazy criminal friends, hey, party's over here, come on through the door. And then as all the bad guys came flooding into the networks, they snuck out in the chaos. So it was this incredibly irresponsible activity. And it caused a lot of headache. It caused a lot of financial loss. It's a big deal in a different way. Now, typically speaking, the Russians and the Chinese operate in the exact opposite way. The Chinese are typically pretty sophisticated, pretty quiet, not trying to make any noise. And the Russians are always loud because part of what they're trying to do is kind of demonstrate that they can stand up to the West without consequences and undermine kind of democratic systems of government, things like that. But in the two biggest most recent cases, they didn't follow that script. And both of them are going to be very, very expensive, very, very laborious, and very, very impactful challenges that we have to respond to.
Great. Thanks very much. What I see another theme developing here. Why are we so vulnerable? Is the US government and its agencies too siloed? Are there other measures that we can take? And it sort of goes to a theme that I have in mind. Is there any kind of way to line up a balance of power? I mean, there was a Wall Street Journal editorial by Cara Fredericks and Richard Fontaine talking about more or less things we can do back. Mm-hmm. Is there, you know, how are we doing? Can we really fight back? Are we equipped? What can we do? Where does that stand?
Well, I mean, we have all the capability in the world. I mean, like none of the stuff I'm describing is stuff that we can't do. I mean, our people are just elegant. I mean, just we can make it look like we're Russians pretending to be Chinese, pretending to be North Koreans. Like, so we can do that, right? That's not a problem. The difficulty is one, you don't have to be elegant to be effective in cyber. You can be a big clumsy oaf and still break China, right? And there are plenty of people who you know, these capabilities to some degree are pretty widely available. The challenge with being us, the United States, is multifold, but the fundamental aspect of it is many of the things that have made us, frankly, that have been advantages for a long time for us in the cyber domain are actually proving to be vulnerabilities. For example, we're a free and open society. And so when something like SolarWinds or the Exchange servers or the Colonial pipeline attack happens, that gets out. The government doesn't squash that, you know, and that has its own kind of psychological impact where our citizenry is kind of constantly going like, good grief, that's another cyber hack. I mean, like, how many are we going to have in the first couple of months of this thing? And you know, we don't hide that. Well, that's not the case in Russia, and that's not the case in China. They do squash it. They do control the environment for the most part. So there's stuff happening, but it doesn't get out. So that's one of it. Two, it's also true that we are the most technologically leveraged nation in the world. So technology plays a deeper, more meaningful role in our everyday society, in every aspect of our society, than it does anywhere else. And so, you know, that leverage means that we have a great, what's called in cybersecurity world, it's called threat surface. We have a huge threat surface, which means we can kind of get attacked in a lot of different ways. We've got everybody in the world coming at us. And it's a largely permissive environment for them. And it's a challenge. And, you know, so there are 6 or 7 kind of aspects that are inherent to the kind of who we are and the way we've evolved as a nation over the course of time that have traditionally been really good for us, but in the cyber domain are proven to be real difficulties that we haven't quite kind of mastered yet. That being said, there are definitely some common sense actions that need to be taken, but specifically what I've said, you know, look, I could talk all day about kind of bureaucracies, better governance things that need to happen, but you know, it's kind of governing, blocking, and tackling, like making sure that agencies can talk to each other, making sure that contracts aren't let in such a way as to where they prevent information sharing or incident response, and like that needs to happen. But even if we got all of that knocked out, there's a kind of a bigger problem that we have to deal with, and that is these bad guys, whether they be states or cyber hacking syndicates, still don't believe that the pain is going to be bad enough to where they're not willing to endure it to kind of get the gain. In other words, until we convince these actors that the juice isn't going to be worth the squeeze, it's going to keep coming, because we can't deny the capability. The capability is out there. It's relatively easy to get. We're a wide open target, and we can't really close that target loop down very much. What we have to do is help them understand that this is no longer going to be acceptable. We're going to put the screws to you. And one thing that I'm currently advocating for in the wake of Colonial and other things is I think our intelligence and military enterprise needs to specifically be let off the chain to go deconstruct these ransomware networks. We know where they are, most of them. We know what they can do. We know who they are. We can reach out and touch them. And there are real geopolitical risks. Let me be very clear. Like, it's not easy, and it's going to have to be managed. But I'm also of the opinion that there is no scenario without risk. And I would rather manage the geopolitical risk than continue to try and absorb the economic and governance risk that we're doing currently with the ransomware attacks. So that's kind of where I'm going. I'm kicking around the idea, should we start letting out kind of cyber letters of marque? Letters of marque, it's in the Constitution. The president actually is allowed to issue what's called a letter of marque. We did it against the Barbary pirates in the 1700s or 1800s, excuse me, where civilian ships were commissioned by the US government to go and to protect American shipping lanes. Well, I think that we have some sufficiently capable private sector cyber actors who, under the right scenarios with the right oversight, we could unleash, and they could help share the burden of kind of engaging this problem.
That's funny. Letters of marque I think of as government licensed piracy that has to be limited to my side, which may be appropriate in too many ways. With that comment, I mean, there is a couple of questions here. Does the government have a role? Should they have a role to play in overall corporate security? What about foreign, and should they affect foreign software as a service companies? What about, I'm not sure what GDPR is, but I think it's a protocol in this range. Is there something like that we could do here?
So GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. It's a massive kind of bureaucratic regulatory framework that every technology related company has to adhere to. Just to give you one data point to kind of give you a sense of scope. Google, one of the largest, most powerful companies to ever exist, it took them 300 man years to come into compliance with GDPR. Now think about trying to be a tech startup and coming into compliance with this. And you know, it's not unrelated that Europe has a essentially non-existent tech industry, right? I mean, they've regulated it into oblivion. So no, I don't think GDPR is the answer. At the same time, you know, we've got some challenges that we're going to have to get a hold on. And some of it may involve some regulation. So for example, the Internet of Things, this idea that, you know, you've got, you know, connected refrigerators and coffee makers and dog bowls and, you know, whatever, light bulbs. That's a huge expansion of what I was describing as the threat surface. Well, there's no standard security protocol for that. So it's just kind of evolving however it evolves. Well, a couple of years ago, there was something called the Mirai botnet, where a million or so IoT devices in the United States were taken over and used to block a significant percentage of the internet traffic on the Eastern Seaboard for a day, because there was no standard security protocol. I don't know that we should let that keep happening. I feel like, no, we should probably come up with some type of standard that everybody needs to meet, and that doesn't feel like an encroachment of you know, kind of big government.
Taking the standards approach, interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And then the only other thing I'll say about that is government does have a role. I think the things I'm discussing really goes to the constitutional provision of like providing for the common defense. But this goes to my point about that kind of migrating responsibility into the private sector. The private sector is just going to have to recognize that you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you don't want government overreach, that means you need to step up. And the government can play a facilitating role. It can provide an advisory role. It can provide an expertise role. But industry's then going to have to kind of pick that ball and run with it. And if they're not willing to do that, well, then, you know, that only leaves a couple of other choices, none of which are particularly good. So, you know, we're going to have to stop giving each other the Heisman and figure out a way forward. Otherwise, you know, we're all going to die together. I mean, we can feel really good about how we've kind of handled ourselves, but you know, if we're all kind of choking out, I don't know that that's a good solution.
Okay, well, somewhat related to some of the last questions, and I want to get both of these in because they're somewhat related to each other. Any recommendations regarding gov coins and, you know, digital currencies? How would we get through international organizations, and, you know, how would it stand with China? And I think this might be sort of related. Is there something of a WTO equivalent, for WTO being a trade organization? Is there any kind of possibility for that kind of equivalent or cooperation in that generic direction for cybersecurity challenges? So coins and the trade parallel is my question.
Yeah. So, okay. So on the WTO equivalent side, here's the challenge. Because of the things I was describing about us being more leveraged and frankly, more technologically advanced, trying to fit ourselves into rules that would apply to other nations typically only constrains us. It doesn't result in any kind of a net benefit. And so it's typically not a good strategy. That being said, I am a proponent of technological alliances where we frankly at least have a partial decoupling with China, and where we work with other democracies to fill that gap and actually facilitate each other's technological growth. Because the United States can't essentially reshore its way to technological leadership, right? We can't bring everything back. And even if we could, if our key allies ultimately get swallowed by China, that's not a result that works. So coming up with foreign alliances that are mutually reinforcing so that we can all kind of thrive technologically, I think that's the preferred method. You know, so anyways, okay, I won't beat that horse, but yeah, that's the challenges of any kind of a WTO function. In terms of digital coinage, cryptocurrencies, things like that, I think the underlying technology of blockchain, which I can discuss later if you like, I think that's going to have broad application. I don't think it's quite ready for prime time, but it's going to have broad application, and we'll see it. In terms of digital currencies, we will also see those. I mean, they're going to be rolled out. So China has actually rolled out a national digital currency. The United States is also going to do that, but it's not going to be like Bitcoin. It's going to be backed by something. And it's not going to be a cryptocurrency in the sense of where it's going to allow the type of autonomy and anonymity that people currently associate with these coins, just because it won't work. It won't work as a kind of a national tender, at large. But I think you will have formal bank-backed current digital currencies rolled out, and I do think that you will have parallel economies on cryptocurrencies. I think you will have that as well, because I don't know how you prevent it. You can't outlaw math, and you can't own every server, and so there's going to be an economy for that, and we'll see kind of how that develops. But I think the biggest portion for most Americans is going to be some type of a bank-backed or nationally backed digital currency, I would think within the next 5 to 10 years.
I just saw a question asking about some response to lax know your customer stuff in cryptocurrencies. Is that basically what you're getting at there?
Hold on. Just trying to find that. Oh, I see. Lax with know your customer, monetary field. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be that'll be one reason why some businesses don't go for it, because they don't feel like they're getting what they need out of it. But then others will see it as a market differentiator. Like, well, if there's a whole economy out there that would prefer to use this type of coinage, we'll provide the opportunity for it.
There's an interesting question. It gets at the question of what can we do in terms of U.S. soft power and making us less of a target in coordination with everything from the political to the financial to whatever other motives. Is there maybe the way to put it is there a first priority in terms of coordinating the political and policy side with the technological side?
Yeah, yes. I mean, the answer to your question is yes. Right now, it used to be the case that there wasn't agreement about the problem, that particularly industry thought, oh no, like, I don't need to get wrapped up in all your geopolitical stuff. I'm just going to kind of keep doing business. I think most people have been disabused of that, mostly, frankly. And I think it was obviously long before this, but the thing that really kind of crystallized a lot of people was China's reaction to COVID-19. When they started threatening PPE and cutting themselves off, and they realized, wait a minute, we have kind of key aspects of our supply chain that are running through China, where that's just a single point of failure. I think that's when a lot of industry realized, okay, we're not going to get to ignore this. We got to figure this out. But what we're still having to overcome is pretty significant political distrust between government and industry. And one of the ways that we will begin to address that is through better political engagement, and by, frankly, employing and leveraging industry as we encourage or engage other nations, and making them feel like they have a seat at the table, because they do. I wrote there's a journal called National Affairs, and I wrote a long essay called The New Superpowers, and I just kind of laid out why private sector technology companies are now a key actor in the global geopolitical environment, and it's because they have geopolitical interests. I mean, they're some of these companies, the top 8 tech companies had an combined, or the top five tech companies in 2018 had profits, just profits, not gross, but just profits, that equaled the GDP of Saudi Arabia, in 1 year.
Wow.
They have talent pipelines that literally draw from all over the world, and they're conducting activities and participating in all the major markets around the world. So these are legit geopolitical players. And so to the degree that we all start acting like it, I think we'll start moving in the right direction.
Quick thought that I wanted to get in. You and Bill Drexel, who's on the panel here, recently put out a piece on quantum computing and quantum technology. Where does that stand, and what kind of implications at this relatively early stage do you see, and what'll it take for that to become important? And how scared or happy should we be about it?
Yeah, it's like everything, like pretty cool, some serious implications. So the 2-second version of what quantum computing is it's taking the peculiar aspects of quantum physics, particularly 2 aspects, something called superposition and entanglement, and applying them in computer science. So superposition, so traditional physics says that something can exist in 2 states simultaneously. In the subatomic world, in quantum world, it can. And when it achieves that, it's called superposition. So in the case of computing, computers are made up of these little, calculators that are switches, a 1 or a 0. Well, as you build a quantum computer, you use something called qubits, and they can be a 1 or a 0 or both. And that exponentially grows your computational power and capability. The other aspect, entanglement, is when you have a particle that somehow becomes entangled, or it develops a relationship with another particle, and regardless of the distance between them, the state of the one determines the state of the other. So if you had 2 dimes spinning on opposite sides of the universe, if you stop the one dime and it's heads, for a certainty that the other dime on the opposite side of the universe is also on heads. Again, if you take a bunch of qubits and you entangle them, you've exponentially grown your computational power. What this means, it opens up all kinds of interesting capabilities, but one of the things that's most relevant that would have very, very broad application is the idea of no longer being able, or having to hypothesize what's going on at the quantum level, but actually having the computational capacity to detect and to model that. And that would have huge, huge implications for essentially every aspect of modern science. And so it's a big deal. We're still a while away before we achieve what's called quantum supremacy, or a general quantum computer. But there's been more progress over the last decade than I think anybody would have ever predicted. And there's been enough of that progress to warrant real optimism and concern about actually realizing quantum computers.
Wow. Oh, let's see. I mean, we have more questions about what should we do with Apple and Google and China? What should we do about protocols when rogues don't subscribe to them? And maybe how do we hold some of the non-state people to their actions from other countries' territories? That may be a little bit of a chance to summarize some of the stuff some of the aspects of which you've been covering here.
So my preference is that American companies or Western companies operating in China will, frankly, wake up and make the rational choice themselves and not need to be coerced into that. But I think that the Chinese government is going to do the coercion and that we don't have to, right? And I think that's beginning to happen. So I don't feel like we need to, make it illegal, for a U.S. company to operate in China or anything like that. That being said, I'm open to the idea of having some type of formal attestation to where American companies have to, annually attest and show some reason to believe. that their products and services aren't being used for, say, large-scale human rights atrocities in China. That's consistent with US law. I don't think that's overly kind of burdensome, but I do think it would force some people to make a choice. So yeah, I think that the biggest hurdles to some of these realizations have actually been jumped recently, and now we're all just trying to find what the new normal is, and how we kind of get to a new balance. And look, part of that, you know, the government has played the heavy, and now it needs to kind of come with the carrot, and it needs to think about how we can help our private sector actors make the transition that we think is in their interest and in the national interest, in a way that kind of takes as much of the sharp edges of these decisions off as we can, constitutionally and otherwise. You know, I have some ideas about some of that, but I haven't completely wrapped it all together. And you know, that's the kind of stuff that we're going to have to work hard on.
Well, I hope we all appreciate that you've racked a lot more together than most of us, or more than we will hear other places. And I really appreciate you coming on. I know we all do. Maybe as a quick way of putting it up, how happy or optimistic should we be, or how cautious and worried should we be today in May 2021?
Well, you know, look, my kind of personal theology doesn't cause me to kind of get too out of whack and lose a lot of sleep. People ask me that, what makes you lose sleep? I don't really lose a lot of sleep. Part of that is, you know, I come out of the intelligence community. I spent 15 years in the U.S. intelligence community. So like my whole career has been some of the worst scenarios out there that having to deal with that. I think there's real reason for optimism. We're going to see some amazing things, and we are already seeing some amazing things. But I'm also a realist, and you know, most things in life involve trade-offs, and so many of the capabilities that we as a society are going to leverage for good and for human thriving, you know, there are other actors who are going to seek to leverage those same technologies and capabilities for power and for human oppression. But I don't think that's a category change. I think it's always been that way. And I think it's always going to be that way, unfortunately. And so instead, I simply kind of engage what I think I can, to the degree that I have any wisdom. I share that freely. I try to learn as much as I can. And I think that's all we can do. I don't think it serves anyone for us to kind of throw our hands up and run for the hills. I think, you know, we do the best that we can. We act with integrity, and we kind of let it, you know, kind of God sort everything else out.
Well, that's a fitting final word, I think. We're so happy to have had you give this talk to us and answer all these questions. I want to thank everybody in the audience for all those great questions and insightful questions. Thanks to Frank. Thanks to Bill Drexel's on the panel. The audience hasn't seen him. He's your research assistant. Diane McLevy and Joanne Mott are our administrators. So I appreciate everybody's efforts, but thanks so much, Klon, for your spending time with us. And hope everybody does see on the chat the link to his weekly bulletin, which I find very useful. And with that, I think we've used our time well.
Thanks.
Very good talking to you.
Appreciate it. Frank, thank you.